The moment Officer Daniel Mercer saw the black woman step out of a black Range Rover at pump number 6, he decided she didn't belong there, and that single decision would cost him more than he could possibly imagine. It was just after 7:40 on a warm Thursday evening at a brightly lit gas station off Route 41 outside Atlanta, the kind of place where commuters grabbed coffee on the way home and families stopped for snacks before heading back to quiet neighborhoods. And everything about the scene felt ordinary, except the way Mercer slowed his cruiser as he passed the luxury SUV and then stopped completely, his eyes fixed on the vehicle as if something about it refused to make sense to him. He didn't see a calm woman stepping out with steady posture and quiet confidence. He saw a question he believed needed answering, and before the fuel nozzle had even clicked into place, he was already opening his door and walking toward her with the certainty of someone who thought he understood exactly what he was looking at. The woman didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't even seem surprised when his shadow crossed the pavement beside her. She simply turned her head slightly, as though she had expected someone like him to arrive eventually, and that calm unsettled him more than anything else. Mercer glanced at the SUV again, then back at her, then at the license plate, as if the metal itself might confess something suspicious. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately as he asked who the vehicle belonged to. She answered simply that it was hers. He paused, just long enough for the silence to feel deliberate instead of accidental, then asked again, slower this time, as though repeating the question might change the answer. She gave him the same response without raising her voice or changing her expression. And that was the moment people nearby began to notice something unusual unfolding beside pump number 6. A man carrying a soda slowed his steps. A teenage couple near the ice machine stopped talking. Even the cashier inside the glass booth glanced up from the register and looked toward the parking lot. Mercer shifted his weight slightly and said the vehicle matched a report that required verification, though he didn't explain what report he meant. And when she calmly asked what kind of verification he needed, his answer came sharper than before as he told her to step away from the SUV and keep her hands visible. She didn't move immediately, not because she was resisting him, but because she seemed to be deciding something silently, something he could not see, but everyone watching could somehow feel building in the air between them. The overhead lights reflected across the polished hood of the Range Rover as she reached toward the driver's door, and Mercer's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, as though expecting her next motion to confirm his suspicions. But instead of opening the door, she pressed the lock button once, then again, and the quiet electronic click echoed across the pavement in a way that made several people nearby look at each other without speaking. Mercer frowned slightly, confused by a reaction he clearly hadn't expected, and asked why she had just locked the vehicle when he hadn't told her she could move yet. She looked at him directly for the first time, her voice steady, calm, and almost too measured for the moment as she said she preferred the car stay exactly where it was until someone else arrived. Mercer's expression changed instantly because there was only one question that mattered now and he hadn't asked it yet. And as he reached for his radio again, he realized he didn't know who she was waiting for or why she sounded so certain they were already on their way. Officer Daniel Mercer lifted his radio slowly, but before he could finish pressing the transmit button, the dispatcher's voice spoke first, sharp and unexpected, as if she had already been waiting for him to call, and the tone alone was enough to make the officer beside the convenience store entrance stop mid-step and turn his head toward the cruiser. Mercer gave the plate number again carefully, louder this time. As though repetition would restore the control, he felt beginning to slip away, and for a few seconds there was only static followed by a pause that stretched longer than normal dispatch silence ever should. The woman remained standing beside the locked Range Rover without moving an inch, her posture steady, her eyes calm, not watching him nervously the way most drivers did during a roadside stop, but watching the scene around her as though she were measuring something invisible unfolding beyond what anyone else could see. Inside the cruiser, the radio crackled again, but instead of the routine confirmation Mercer expected, the dispatcher's reply came slower than usual, each word spaced carefully. And then she asked him to repeat his location even though he had already given it twice. That question alone caused the cashier behind the glass window to lean closer to the counter, as if he sensed something unusual developing outside under the bright canopy lights. Mercer answered again, his voice firmer now, stating the gas station address clearly and requesting routine verification status. But the dispatcher did not respond immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a restraint that made him glance instinctively toward the woman again, as though she might somehow be connected to whatever hesitation he was hearing through the speaker. The dispatcher asked him to stand by for supervisory confirmation. Mercer frowned because supervisory confirmation was not part of a simple vehicle check. And yet before he could question the request, another voice entered the radio channel without introduction, deeper and unmistakably authoritative, asking him to confirm whether he was still engaged with the driver at pump number 6. Several people nearby shifted their weight quietly, sensing the change in atmosphere, even though none of them could hear the words coming through the radio clipped to Mercer's shoulder. The woman did not react to the second voice at all, which somehow made the silence around her feel heavier rather than lighter. And when Mercer answered yes, the new voice paused briefly before instructing him to remain exactly where he was until additional units arrived. That instruction was not optional, and everyone who had ever worn a uniform would have recognized the difference instantly. Mercer glanced across the lot, as if expecting to see flashing lights already approaching, but the road beyond the station entrance remained quiet except for passing evening traffic heading south toward the interstate. He turned back toward the woman and asked her again why she had locked the vehicle when he was conducting an investigation, and she answered with the same calm tone as before that she believed it was better for everyone if the vehicle stayed secured until the right people arrived. The phrase "the right people" settled into the air between them like something heavier than ordinary conversation, and for the first time Mercer realized he did not know who she meant or how she seemed so certain they were already involved. A young man near the ice freezer quietly raised his phone and began recording without stepping closer, and the gas station manager stepped halfway out of the office door as if deciding whether he should intervene or stay where he was. Mercer reached for his radio again to request clarification from dispatch, but before he could speak, the supervisor's voice returned once more, lower now, telling him clearly that the situation was no longer classified as routine verification and that he should wait for the arriving unit before continuing any further contact with the driver. And as Mercer slowly lowered his hand from the radio, he realized he had just been instructed to stop asking questions he had not yet finished asking. The silence that followed the supervisor's instruction did not feel like the end of the conversation, but the beginning of something Mercer had not prepared for, because routine stops did not involve supervisors stepping directly onto the radio channel unless something larger had already been set in motion somewhere beyond the parking lot. He shifted his stance slightly beside the pump and tried to regain the familiar rhythm of authority he relied on during traffic encounters. But the woman standing beside the locked Range Rover still had not shown any sign of concern or urgency, and that calm continued to spread through the scene in a way that unsettled him more with each passing second. He asked her again if she could explain why dispatch had requested supervisory confirmation on a simple plate check, and she answered quietly that sometimes information reached the system before officers understood why it mattered, and the wording of that sentence caused the young man recording near the ice freezer to lower his phone just slightly, as if he sensed the meaning behind her voice even though Mercer did not. A faint sound of approaching tires rolled across the edge of the gas station lot, not fast, not urgent, but deliberate enough that several people near the convenience store entrance turned their heads at the same time, and Mercer followed their gaze expecting to see one of his own units arriving with flashing lights. Yet the vehicle turning into the station carried no emergency signals at all and moved with the controlled pace of someone who was not responding to a call but arriving for a purpose already understood. The sedan came to a slow stop along the edge of the canopy lights without drawing attention to itself, and the driver remained inside for several seconds longer than Mercer expected, as though waiting for something unseen to settle before stepping out. Mercer glanced back toward his radio again, but the channel remained silent now, which only made the earlier instructions feel heavier in his memory. The woman beside the Range Rover did not turn to look at the arriving vehicle immediately, and that detail alone made him realize she had probably expected it before anyone else had even noticed it approaching. He asked her directly who she was waiting for, and she answered with the same steady tone that she believed the right people always arrived when procedures needed to be followed carefully. And the way she said carefully sounded less like reassurance and more like a warning he had not yet understood. The manager stepped another few feet out of the office doorway and glanced between Mercer and the parked sedan as though trying to decide whether he should speak or remain quiet, while the evening traffic continued passing along Route 41 as if nothing unusual were happening under the bright, white canopy lights. Mercer tried once more to continue the stop as though nothing had changed, asking her for identification so he could complete the verification process properly. And this time, she reached slowly into her purse with the same deliberate calm she had shown from the beginning. But instead of handing him the identification immediately, she held it in her hand for a moment, as if measuring whether the timing mattered more than the request itself. He extended his hand to take the card, expecting the simple confirmation he believed would restore control over the situation. But before the card reached his fingers, the door of the quiet sedan opened behind him, and the sound of a second set of footsteps crossing the pavement made him realize he was no longer the only officer standing inside a conversation he had started alone. The footsteps that crossed the pavement behind Officer Daniel Mercer were calm, measured, and completely unhurried, the kind of steps taken by someone who already understood exactly why they had arrived and did not need to announce it. And before Mercer even turned fully around, he sensed the shift in the atmosphere near pump number 6, as several people standing under the canopy lights stopped whispering altogether. The man who stepped out of the dark sedan was not wearing a patrol uniform and carried no visible urgency in his posture. Yet there was something unmistakably official in the way he approached the scene, without hesitation and without asking permission to enter the space Mercer had been controlling only moments earlier. Mercer turned slightly toward him, expecting at first that the arriving man might be part of a neighboring jurisdiction responding to the supervisor's earlier instruction. But instead of addressing Mercer immediately, the newcomer slowed beside the Range Rover and gave a brief, respectful nod toward the woman standing beside it. And the simplicity of that gesture made Mercer realize he was no longer the central figure in the conversation unfolding in front of him. The woman finally extended the identification card she had been holding, but instead of handing it to Mercer, she passed it calmly to the man who had just arrived, as though the timing of that exchange had always been planned long before Mercer asked for it. And the newcomer accepted the card with quiet familiarity before turning slightly so that the overhead canopy light reflected across its surface. Mercer stepped closer, expecting the card to be returned to him so he could complete the verification process he had started earlier. Yet the newcomer did not hand it back immediately, and instead looked at Mercer with an expression that carried neither confrontation nor apology, but something closer to certainty. He introduced himself simply as Marcus Bennett, and his voice carried the controlled tone of someone used to speaking inside rooms where decisions affected more than one person at a time. And before Mercer could ask why he was present, Bennett asked whether Mercer had already contacted his shift supervisor directly or whether the request had come through dispatch without explanation. The question felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation, and Mercer answered that the instruction had come through dispatch only minutes earlier. Bennett nodded once as though that answer matched what he expected to hear, and then returned his attention briefly to the identification card still in his hand, holding it carefully beneath the bright canopy light before offering it back to the woman rather than to Mercer. Several people watching from near the convenience store entrance exchanged quiet looks with one another because they had never seen an officer pause during such a simple identification check, and even the gas station manager remained still beside the office doorway, as though waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. Mercer cleared his throat and asked directly whether Bennett was attached to the responding unit that dispatch had mentioned, but Bennett answered calmly that he had arrived, because it was important the situation remain exactly where it was until the proper documentation process began, and the phrasing of documentation process settled over the scene with a weight that Mercer could not immediately interpret. The woman beside the Range Rover finally spoke again, her voice steady and precise as she asked Mercer whether he intended to continue the stop now that additional personnel had arrived, and the question sounded less like a challenge and more like an invitation for him to reconsider what had already taken place. Mercer glanced once more at his radio as though expecting clarification to arrive at any second, but the channel remained silent, and as he looked back toward Bennett, he realized that the man standing between him and the locked vehicle had not arrived to assist him at all, but had arrived to witness something he had not yet understood he was still in the middle of creating. Officer Daniel Mercer had handled hundreds of roadside stops over the years, but none of them had ever begun to feel like this one, because the longer Marcus Bennett remained standing calmly beside the Range Rover, without stepping aside or returning authority to Mercer, the clearer it became that whatever process had started here was no longer moving in the direction Mercer expected. The woman beside the vehicle still had not raised her voice once, and that silence had begun to change the behavior of everyone watching from under the canopy lights, including the cashier who now stood completely still behind the glass counter, and the young man near the ice freezer who had quietly lifted his phone again as though sensing that something important was still unfolding. Mercer finally asked Bennett directly whether he intended to identify his role in the situation, and Bennett answered with the same measured tone he had used since arriving that he was present to ensure the documentation of the interaction remained complete and accurate from this point forward, which was not the answer Mercer expected and not the answer that restored control to the stop. Mercer glanced once more at the woman, then at the identification card now back in her hand, and asked again whether she would provide it to him so he could finalize the verification process properly. And this time, she stepped slightly closer to the overhead light and turned the card so its lettering was fully visible in the brightness above pump number 6. For a brief second, Mercer did not react because the title printed beneath her name did not match the assumptions he had built the stop around only minutes earlier, and the stillness that followed spread quickly across the pavement as though everyone nearby sensed that something had just shifted even if they could not yet see what he was seeing. Marcus Bennett watched Mercer carefully but did not interrupt him, and the woman allowed the silence to remain exactly where it was until Mercer looked up from the card again with an expression that carried uncertainty for the first time since he had stepped out of his cruiser. She introduced herself clearly as Judge Vanessa Carter, her voice calm and steady as though the introduction were not meant to surprise anyone except the person who had asked the first question beside the locked vehicle. The young man near the ice freezer lowered his phone slightly, as if realizing he had just recorded something far more important than he expected, and the gas station manager stepped another few feet forward from the office doorway, without speaking. Mercer glanced instinctively toward his radio again, as though expecting confirmation to arrive through the channel that had already gone silent minutes earlier, but no voice came back this time. Bennett finally spoke again, not loudly but clearly enough that Mercer understood every word as he explained that dispatch had already flagged the vehicle registration before Mercer initiated the stop, and that supervisory confirmation had been requested because Judge Carter was currently assigned to review several active departmental procedure cases involving traffic enforcement conduct. The meaning of that statement settled slowly across the space between them as evening traffic continued moving past the station entrance without slowing. And for the first time, Mercer realized that the interaction he believed he had started as a routine verification had already become part of something larger than the moment he was still standing inside. Judge Carter watched him quietly for another second before asking whether he wished to continue the stop now that her identification had been confirmed in full view of both the arriving witness and the security cameras mounted above the canopy lights. And the question sounded less like a challenge than a decision he had not yet understood he was expected to make. Officer Daniel Mercer did not answer immediately because the question Judge Vanessa Carter had just asked was not the kind that appeared in routine traffic encounters. And the longer he stood beside pump number 6, without speaking, the more clearly he understood that the authority he believed he had carried into the gas station parking lot had already shifted somewhere beyond his reach. The canopy lights reflected across the polished surface of the Range Rover again as evening traffic continued moving along Route 41 without slowing, and the ordinary rhythm of the surrounding neighborhood made the stillness near the vehicle feel even more deliberate than before. Mercer finally cleared his throat and said that he had initiated the stop based on verification concerns related to the vehicle. But even as he spoke, the explanation sounded weaker than it had only minutes earlier when no one else had been standing beside the SUV except him. Marcus Bennett listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his attention focused not on Mercer alone, but on the space around them, as though he were observing more than a single conversation unfolding under the canopy lights. Judge Carter nodded once after Mercer finished speaking, and then asked whether he had documented the specific reason for initiating the verification request through dispatch before approaching her vehicle. And the phrasing of her question made Mercer realize she was not asking casually, but referencing a procedural step that could be reviewed later with exact timing attached to it. He glanced again toward his radio as though expecting dispatch to clarify the earlier exchange, but the channel remained silent except for routine background traffic from unrelated calls moving across the frequency. The young man near the ice freezer had stepped slightly closer now, still holding his phone at chest level, but no longer pretending he was not recording, and the gas station manager remained standing near the office doorway with his arms folded as though waiting for instructions he had not yet received. Mercer answered that he had requested verification immediately after observing the vehicle at the pump, and Judge Carter listened carefully before asking whether dispatch had confirmed any irregularity with the registration prior to the supervisor entering the channel. And this time Mercer did not respond right away because he understood that the sequence of events mattered more than the answer itself. Marcus Bennett finally spoke again, his voice calm but precise as he explained that the timing of dispatch involvement had already been logged automatically, and that the presence of supervisory confirmation before the completion of the verification sequence indicated the situation had been flagged earlier than Mercer realized. The explanation settled slowly across the space between them, and for the first time Mercer noticed the small security camera mounted above the canopy light directly facing pump number 6. Its lens angled downward in a way that suggested the entire interaction had been visible from the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. Judge Carter followed his glance briefly and then returned her attention to him with the same steady expression she had carried since the beginning, asking whether he understood that documentation of the stop would now include both the dispatch record and the video coverage from the station itself. Mercer shifted his weight slightly and said that he understood documentation was routine for all traffic encounters, but Bennett answered quietly that this interaction had already moved beyond routine classification before Mercer finished his initial plate request. Several people standing near the entrance exchanged silent looks with one another because the meaning of that statement did not require explanation. And as Mercer looked again toward the locked vehicle beside Judge Carter, he realized that the stop he believed he could still conclude had already become part of a record he no longer controlled. The realization that the interaction was no longer classified as routine did not settle over Officer Daniel Mercer all at once, but instead moved through him slowly as he stood beside pump number 6 under the bright canopy lights, because everything around him still looked ordinary even though nothing about the situation remained the same as it had been only minutes earlier. Judge Vanessa Carter remained exactly where she had been since the beginning, calm and steady beside the locked Range Rover, her posture unchanged as though she had already anticipated every step the evening would take long before Mercer stepped out of his cruiser. Marcus Bennett shifted slightly and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket with deliberate care, not in a hurried way and not with the urgency Mercer associated with enforcement activity, but with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the timing of what he was about to do mattered more than the movement itself. Several people near the entrance of the convenience store noticed the motion immediately and fell silent again, including the gas station manager, who had now stepped completely outside the office doorway and stood watching from only a few yards away. Bennett removed a slim sealed envelope and held it at his side for a moment before speaking. And when he finally did, his voice carried the same controlled clarity he had used since arriving at the station as he explained that documentation of the encounter had already been initiated prior to his arrival, and that his presence at the scene was part of a procedural observation requirement connected to ongoing departmental conduct reviews. Mercer looked at the envelope without reaching for it because the explanation did not match any situation he had previously encountered during a vehicle stop, and the stillness that followed stretched long enough for the young man near the ice freezer to adjust his phone again, so the camera faced directly toward pump number 6. Judge Carter watched Mercer carefully for another second before speaking, her tone steady but unmistakably precise as she explained that several recent enforcement encounters involving vehicle assumption patterns had already been placed under administrative review within the same jurisdiction Mercer represented, and that the timing of this interaction now placed it inside the same observation window as those earlier reports. The meaning of that statement did not require further explanation for anyone familiar with how documentation reviews developed once they began, and Mercer felt the weight of the words settle across the scene even before Bennett extended the sealed envelope toward him at last. Bennett did not release the envelope immediately when Mercer accepted it, but instead held it lightly for one extra second, as though making sure the transfer itself would be remembered clearly by everyone watching. And then he explained that the document inside confirmed that the interaction at pump number 6 had already been entered into a preliminary review record the moment dispatch requested supervisory confirmation earlier that evening. The gas station manager shifted his stance slightly, as if understanding that the quiet encounter he had first assumed would last only a few minutes had now become something else entirely, and the security camera mounted above the canopy lights continued facing directly toward the three figures standing beside the locked vehicle without interruption. Mercer opened the envelope slowly and looked at the first page inside without speaking, and although no one else could see the wording printed across the top line, Judge Carter watched him carefully as though she already knew exactly which sentence he had reached first. Bennett stepped back half a pace then and allowed the space between them to widen slightly, his role no longer that of a participant in the stop, but clearly that of a witness to what had already been documented. And as Mercer lifted his eyes from the page again, he realized that the interaction he believed he could still resolve had already been formally recorded long before he understood he was standing inside it. Officer Daniel Mercer kept his eyes on the document inside the envelope longer than he intended to, because the first line alone confirmed what Marcus Bennett had already explained without needing to repeat it aloud, and the stillness under the canopy lights seemed to deepen as everyone nearby sensed that something official had just moved beyond the point where it could quietly disappear. The paper did not look dramatic, and it did not carry any urgent markings that would have drawn attention from a distance. Yet the wording at the top identified the encounter at pump number 6 as part of an active civil review intake sequence, and Mercer understood immediately that the timing listed beside the dispatch reference matched the exact minute he had first requested the plate check earlier that evening. Judge Vanessa Carter watched him calmly while he read, not with satisfaction and not with confrontation, but with the same quiet patience she had shown from the beginning, as though she had always expected the process to unfold in precisely this order. The young man near the ice freezer lowered his phone slightly again, not because the scene had become less important, but because the silence surrounding Mercer now carried a different kind of weight that did not require movement to be understood. Mercer looked up from the document and asked Bennett whether the intake sequence had already been finalized or whether the review status remained preliminary. And Bennett answered with the same steady tone he had used throughout the encounter that the intake had been formally timestamped the moment supervisory confirmation entered the dispatch channel, and that all additional documentation from this point forward would simply extend the existing record rather than begin a new one. The explanation settled across the scene with quiet clarity because it meant the stop Mercer believed he could still explain had already been preserved exactly as it occurred from its earliest moment beside the Range Rover. Judge Carter spoke again then, her voice calm and precise as she explained that the review intake referenced in the document included not only the dispatch record, but also any recorded statements made during the initial contact sequence, and the wording reminded Mercer of the exact sentence he had spoken near the fuel pump before dispatch responded differently than expected. The gas station manager shifted his stance once more and glanced briefly toward the security camera mounted above the canopy lights, as if realizing the lens had captured more than anyone inside the store had first assumed. Bennett stepped slightly to the side so that Mercer remained clearly visible beneath the overhead lighting while still holding the document in his hands, and the positioning made it obvious that the interaction was no longer being guided by the officer who had initiated it, but by the process that had already begun documenting it. Mercer asked whether he was expected to remain at the scene until additional instruction arrived from his supervisor, and Bennett answered that the supervisor had already been notified of the intake classification and would be reviewing the encounter record directly rather than through routine reporting channels. Judge Carter listened quietly for another moment before adding that encounters entered into review intake status often continued beyond the location where they began, because documentation frequently required confirmation from multiple sources once the initial sequence had been preserved. Mercer lowered the document slowly as he absorbed the meaning of that statement. And for the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, he understood that what had started beside a fuel pump under ordinary evening lights was now moving toward a process that would follow him long after the canopy above pump number 6 disappeared behind him. Officer Daniel Mercer folded the document slowly after reading the final line a second time because the meaning of what had just been confirmed beside pump number 6 did not end at the edge of the gas station parking lot, but extended into a process that had already begun moving beyond his control. And the quiet evening traffic continuing along Route 41 seemed almost unreal compared to the weight of the moment settling under the canopy lights. Judge Vanessa Carter remained standing beside the locked Range Rover with the same calm composure she had carried from the beginning, her posture unchanged as though the sequence unfolding around her had followed an expected timeline rather than an unexpected interruption. And Marcus Bennett stepped slightly closer again with the steady presence of someone whose responsibility was not to escalate the situation, but to make sure its record remained complete and accurate from that point forward. Mercer finally asked whether the intake classification referenced in the document would remain internal to departmental review or whether it would move into formal civil evaluation outside his precinct's reporting structure. And Bennett answered with quiet clarity that intake classification at that level automatically initiated coordination with external oversight once the initial interaction record reached verification status, which meant the documentation created under the canopy lights was already scheduled for review beyond the jurisdiction Mercer represented. The gas station manager glanced once more toward the security camera mounted above the pump island, as if understanding that the footage recorded there had become part of something larger than the quiet evening he had expected when his shift began. And the young man near the ice freezer lowered his phone completely now because the silence surrounding the three figures beside the Range Rover no longer felt like curiosity, but like recognition that the outcome of the encounter had already moved past the moment itself. Judge Carter spoke again then, her voice calm and measured as she explained that interactions entered into civil review intake frequently required confirmation of the initial statements made during contact, and that the wording used at the beginning of the encounter often became central to understanding how assumptions shaped procedural decisions once documentation was examined later. Mercer listened without interrupting because he understood exactly which statement she was referencing, and why the timing of that sentence mattered now more than it had when he first spoke it beside the pump. Bennett then explained that supervisory review had already scheduled follow-up documentation requests for the following morning, and that Mercer's shift command staff would receive formal notice once the intake sequence transitioned into its next stage, and the clarity of that explanation made it impossible to mistake what the next hours would bring even before any additional instruction arrived through official channels. Judge Carter finally stepped toward the driver's door of the Range Rover and unlocked it with a quiet electronic click that echoed softly beneath the canopy lights. But before entering the vehicle, she paused and looked directly at Mercer with the same steady expression she had maintained since the beginning, and said that the purpose of oversight review was not to challenge authority, but to ensure it remained grounded in fairness whenever it was exercised in public spaces where assumptions could shape outcomes more quickly than facts. Mercer nodded once without speaking because there was nothing left to add that would change what had already been recorded beside pump number 6. And as Judge Carter entered the vehicle and Bennett returned to the quiet sedan parked near the edge of the canopy lights, Mercer remained standing for another moment beneath the camera mounted above the pumps, realizing that what had begun as a simple stop beside a luxury vehicle had ended as a documented lesson about how quickly authority could shift the moment certainty replaced understanding.